Welcome everyone. My name is Khalid Lawal. I'll be taking you through the third module for the PMP preparation class. We'll be doing the work under this module, and the following lessons objectives will be discussed by topics. A, to assess and manage risk. B, to execute the project with the urgency required to deliver business value. C, to manage communications. D, engage stakeholders. E, create project artifacts. F, manage project changes. G, attack issues with the optimal action to achieve project success. And H, to confirm approach for knowledge transfer. We'll start this model with the first topic, which will be to assess and manage risk. The enablers here are to determine risk management approach, to iteratively identify, assess, prioritize risks and risk responses, determine risk response, and implement risk response. The deliverables that we talked about will be risk management plan, the risk register, create risk response plan, implement risk response plan. The tools to be utilized for these topics are organization process assets, your OPAs, meetings, expert judgments, risk analysis techniques, update risk register, risk probability and risk impact assessment, monitor and manage risks. So what is a risk? A risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more of your project objectives. So when you have an event that will occur, and it's uncertain yet, but you can envisage it. And when it occurs, it has a positive or negative effect on one or more of your project objectives or deliverables, then that is a risk. And we can't talk about risk without talking about trigger conditions. These are events or situations that indicate that a risk is about to occur. Once you're assessing risk, it's always good to have your trigger conditions attached to it that tells you when that event is about to occur. So the primary components for risk include a measure of probability that that risk event will occur, and also the impact of that risk occurring on your projects. Oftentimes, we always talk about risk in a negative manner only and not about the positive aspect of it. Hence why we have two types of risk. The positive risk, which are risk that produce a positive project outcome, and they also referred to as opportunities. Then you have the negative risk. There are risks that have a negative impact on your projects and are referred to as threats. We can't talk about risk without talking about the risk management plan. This is a component of the project or program or portfolio management plan that describe how risk management activities will be structured and performed throughout the life cycle of your project, program, or portfolio. And it will contain the following entities inside. They will include risk strategies for addressing your risk management. They will talk about, you have methodologies for your risk management, then the roles and responsibility of team members or stakeholders as it comes down to risk, who identify, who implements, who mitigates, and approval levels. Also, your risk management plan will contain the funding approach, the timing, risk categories, stakeholders' appetites, risk appetites, definition of risk probability and impact, probability and impact matrix, and also it will contain reporting formats for your risk aspect of your project. So during the course of the project lifecycle, you'll be reporting on the risk identified initially before the project started, and also the risk identified along the project lifecycle. Eventually, in the event that those risk events happens, then what are the mitigating factors you are being applied to that risk entity? You also should have in your risk management plan tracking documents for your risk identified. How do you identify risk? There are different techniques to use when talking about risk identification. Number one is to use expert judgments. You can get a subject matter expert in that process or procedures or that phase of the project that helps you look at the project holistically and help you identify the risk attached to that process or the phase or the project in its entirety. You can use data gathering through brainstorming, through checklist analysis, or through interviews and other data gathering tools or systems. You can also use data analysis to identify risk. Example of data analysis types to be used when identifying risk. A typical example is the root cause analysis, which features a cause and effect diagram that tells you the origin of the cause being investigated and the possible effect it will have on your project in terms of the processes, in terms of the deliverables vis-a-vis their requirements. Also, in data analysis, you can consider the assumption and constraint analysis, the SWOT analysis, which is your strength, weakness, opportunity, threat analysis for your project. And also you need to analyze the document. Do a document analysis that actually peruse your document so well to get information as to possible risk attached to the entities or the contents of those documents. You can use facilitation, prompt lists, and also meetings as it concerns risk workshop or centers around risk workshop. Project risk management is a body of knowledge area that includes the process of conducting risk management planning, identification, analysis, response planning, response implementation, and monitoring risk on a project. So when you're approaching risk management, you approach it in the context of project risk management. The project management knowledge area that actually include all the process that tells you about how you conduct your risk management planning, and also the identification of your risk, the analysis of your risk, the response plan which vis-a-vis your identified risk, the response implementation strategy and plans also, and also how you monitor your risk on a project is called the project risk management. And when you're talking about managing risk, you manage risk in order to get reward and also to stop a negative aspect of the impact of the risk from occurring. When you are talking about risk classification, there are two basic classifications for risk classification method. You have the effect-based risk classification and also the source-based risk classification. Analyzing the major risks that are inherent to a project and their effects upon time, cost, quality, and scope are being grouped as effect-based risk classification system. When we're talking about source-based risk classification, we're talking about a method of analyzing risk in terms of its origin. The origin and the source may be internal to the project, maybe external to the project, can be a technical source, a non-technical source, industry-specific source for that risk, or generic risk sources. So once you have that kind of risk in terms of origin, that classification of risk in terms of its origin, that is a source-based risk classifications. And you can't talk about the project environment without talking about the business risk aspect of it. Although you should understand by now that your project is always has a business value attached to it. If there's a business value attached to your project, you need to talk about the business risk attached to your project. They are inherent to the business of the project and its originating organization, and all projects have potentials for loss or profits. Then you have insurable risk. When you've classified your risk and you have seen that there are risks that can actually impact losses and profits, then you should actually have insurance purchased to offset those losses. And those insurance do not cover your profit, but actually offsets your, do not cover your profit, but offsets your losses. We'll also talk about the different types of business risk involved in a project. You can have competitive business risk. This happens when you have increased competition in the marketplace and a rival company developing a superior product. What that means now is you're splitting your target markets and your demands for your product, and also your demand or your supply for the resources being used for the product. You have a competition in that field. What that gives you is a competitive kind of business risk you need to envisage and plan for, and have a mitigating plan strategy for. You also have legislative business risk. When new laws or changes in regulations governing your product, good, or services that requires your company to spend more to maintain compliance, you know when such law happens, it comes at a cost. And when you have to pay more to comply, then that means there is an element of risk involved, especially when you've not planned it, when you've not planned for it initially when originating your projects. But you can eventually have a legislative business risk mitigating plan before you start, so that in case these new laws and changes regulations occur, have a response plan attached to it. Then you have your monetary business risk. When you have increased prices for raw materials, increased taxes, increased operating costs, and losses due to non-payment by customers, you need to actually factor monetary business rates when planning for your project. So in case the prices of raw materials increase, in case you have increased taxes, in case you have increase in operating costs, and also when your customers do not pay at the time due, and you've actually now have the monetary business risk raising its head up in your projects, be sure you have identified that before you start the project and plan for it. The last one we'll talk about is the operational business risk. These are fraud, theft, employee injury, workplace accidents, and damage to equipment. We are aware of the impact of all these descriptions I just gave. Of course, when you have damage to equipment or you have workplace accidents giving rise to employee injury, you know the impact it has in terms of the output of that particular employee, and also the negative impact it has on the value of that employee to that processes giving rise to the products for that project. How are we to talk about risk when we can talk about risk tolerance? It is the maximum amount of risk and the potential impact of that risk occurring that a project manager or stakeholder is willing to accept. So once you have identified your risk and you actually incorporating your project management plan together and making steps to mitigate them when they happen, it's always good to actually identify what your risk tolerance is, being a project manager or the stakeholders, or you have to consider it from a two spectrum. How much risk are they willing to accept for their projects? So that needs to be defined. So you know when you get to a certain level, which we will discuss later, you either accept it or you address it. So next thing we'll talk about is the risk appetite. It is the degree of uncertainty an organization or individual is willing to accept in anticipation for a reward. So you might plan your project or plan your activities or processes in a way that they have higher risk appetite in terms of the reward you want to get for that particular risk. It is it's an opportunity. What is your risk appetite toward that factor linked to that risk occurring? So it's the degree of uncertainty an organization or individual, being the project manager or its team, is willing to accept in anticipation for a reward. We're talking about risk tolerance or risk appetite. We talk about the risk threshold. It's the level of risk exposure above which risks are either addressed and below which risk may be accepted. So you have a threshold whereby above it, you need to address your risk, and below it, you can accept your risk. So that talks about that threshold now relates back to your tolerance and has a factor of your risk appetite incorporated in it when defining, planning, and managing your risk. What are the guidelines to iteratively identify, assess, and prioritize your risk? One is to perform a structured review of appropriate documentation. Like I said earlier, your documentation analysis is very important. And when you're doing that, you need to actually, when you're doing document analysis from other planning processes with your key project stakeholders, to ensure that there is an understanding of each, both all the way the documentations flow from the planning processes and the way they link, and how each project stakeholders analyze it in terms of their tolerance, in terms of their threshold, and in terms of their appetite when it concerns risk. So use one or more risk identification techniques to identify your risk and other possible triggers. So you might as well want to take from your body of tools and use one or more that best fits into your project identification of risk. You get all the risk in your risk register and actually identify triggers for them. 3 is to be consistent. Whatever method you adopt, apply it systematically across your project. Before your project begins, identify risks in every project segment and work package. Apply your method consistently, but be on the lookout for special circumstances that might arise in any project segment. So in a way, be consistent in the method you are adopting or this strategy you are adopting for your risk management plan, but always have a room for flexibility in the circumstances that you have a project segment that involves you to utilize another approach in terms of risk identification, analysis, and prioritizing, and even management of that risk. Another guideline is to consult relevant historical information, such as risk response plans and final reports from previous similar projects that may include the lessons learned, describing problems and their resolutions. Another one is once risks have been identified, group them into categories that reflect common sources of risk in your industry or application area. The last one is to use your results of your analysis to initiate your risk register. We are talking about risk. Once you've identified them, you need to actually do your analysis on them. One of the analyses you need to do is qualitative risk analysis. This is a technique used to determine the probability of occurrence and the impact of each identified risk. So it determines your risk exposure of your project by multiplying the probability and the impact together to give you a weighted range, a weighted metrics for your risk. It provides the list of prioritized risk for further actions. So in doing that, in actually trying to determine the exposure of your project to that risk when you're multiplying the probability and impact, in that way you have a proper list of prioritized risk in terms of how you want to analyze it based on the multiplication of probability and impact. An example of qualitative analysis, risk analysis, is the probability and impact matrix that you need to create. It's a grid of mapping the probability of occurrence of each risk and its impact on the project objectives if that risk occurs. So an example is what you have on your slide, where you have your risk being classified into two initially, into threats and opportunities, and you have the levels of impact of those risks, where you have the high, very high, medium, low, very low. And on the x-axis, you also have the same rating, the same rating system, where you have very low, low, moderate, high, high. So you have to sit down with your project team, sit down with subject matter experts, and identify and apportion metrics in which you classify your probability and risk impact on your project, then plot them on this table to see which risk item identified has the highest impact in terms of their probability and their probability and impact level when you multiply them together. So an example of probability impact matching is what is shown on your slide, and it's very efficient when planning your risk management, and also when you want to analyze your risk. Another aspect of analysis of risk is the quantitative risk analysis. It's a technique used to assess the risk exposure events to overall project objectives and determine the confidence level of achieving the project objectives. This helps you to identify time and the cost contingencies of the project, and it refines and enhances the prioritization and scoring of risk. After you've identified your risk, after you've assessed your risk, after you've analyzed your risk, you now need to plan risk responses. So planning risk responses consists of developing options, selecting strategies, and agreeing on actions to address overall project risk exposure, as well as to treat individual project risk. The risks are addressed by priority and resources and activities that can be added to the budget, schedule, and project management plan to support the risk. So once you've identified it, once you've developed option and strategy to address them, you've grouped them in a certain hierarchy of priority, and you've actually developed resources and activities which translate into budget and schedules, and with the support of your project management plan that helps you mitigate the risk in the event that they occur. Each risk is assigned a risk response, which is an action to address that risk and the person to implement that action. We'll talk about initially the roles and responsibilities of your project team. So you need that in assigning a resource, an individual, to implement the action, the risk response that you've prescribed for that particular risk. There are various risk response strategies to choose from to determine the risk response from each risk. Do not limit your response or strategy to just one. Have layers and layers of risk strategies and responses to address your risk. So in the event that it happens, you have another or a sub risk strategy attached to it, so that risk doesn't get out of hand or the acceptance is done properly. A fallback plan, just as I've explained earlier, can be developed in the case the primary strategy is not effective. Secondary risks can also be reviewed. These are risks that occur as a result of implementing a risk response. In the event that you, after your risk trigger has occurred and you've seen that your occurrence is very evident and the risk event is occurring, and you've implemented your risk response in terms of the strategy that you want to use. After that whole scenario, there might be other risks that actually sprout or originate from that process, and those are called secondary risk. That the set of secondary risks you get from that scenario needs to be reviewed, analyzed, and planned for too. You have your negative risk strategies plans or strategies/plans on your screen. You either escalate, that means you report to your higher authority or higher upper management above your authority level. You avoid, practically take another direction as to where the path that leads you to that risk. Another one is to transfer. One of the good strategy for risk is to use a risk transfer system or strategy where you transfer that risk to another entity who is more or that situation is more equipped to handle that risk effectively than the ones you have. The next one is to mitigate. Mitigate means just implementing your response plan as you propose for that risk to ensure that it's being resolved. The last one is to accept. Accept it, take the effect, and use your contingencies to surmount over the risk event that just occurred. For positive risk strategies, you have them on the screen. The first one is to escalate. Let your upper management authority understand that the risk you've identified is about to happen. Escalate it. Exploit it. Take advantage, maximum advantage of that particular event, that risk event you plan for. Enhance it. If you have the opportunity to increase the impact or the probability of it happening, do so. Share the outcomes of that risk across board and make sure it's translates across your project. Then accept that risk when it happens. If you're not going to exploit it or enhance it, you might as well just accept it as it comes. So what's our contingencies plan? I've talked about contingencies plan now and then or slightly during my previous conversation. They are risk response strategy developed in advance. That's before things go wrong. It is meant to be used if and when identified risk become reality. So your contingency plan is a risk response strategy you develop, having in mind the identified risk, the possibility of occurrence of that identified risk. So when it's in the event that eventually occur, then you implement your contingency plan. It allows the project manager to react quickly and appropriately to the risk event, mitigating its negative impact and increasing its potential benefits. It may include a fallback plan for risk with higher impact. So when you have higher impact, your contingency plan may have a fallback plan that helps you have a secondary solution for that risk event. What are the guidelines to determine and implement risk responses? 1, examine each identified risk to determine its cause and how it may affect project objective. That means brainstorming possible strategies even for each risk. 2, choose the response strategy that is most likely to be effective for each identified risk. 3, if you're unable to bring a risk rating below the organization's risk threshold, ask your sponsors for help. Do not be shy to get help from upper management. Identify backup strategies for risk with higher risk factor scores. As I was explaining just a moment ago, in the event of having a high risk factor attached to a particular event and you have a contingency plan, it's okay to have a fallback plan which acts as a secondary strategy to mitigate that particular risk with a high risk factor. Also, determine the amount of contingency reserve necessary to deal with accepted risk. When you've planned for risk occurrence and in your strategy of risk management that particular risk will be accepted in the event that it occurs, you need now to have a contingency reserve which you put in your budget management plan to cover the cost for that particular mitigation or strategy you want to use. Another guideline is to determine how much of a contingency reserve you should set aside for an unknown risk. Even though you have the kind of business, different type of business risk we discussed, even for unknown ones or the ones you identify during your project life cycle, you should actually know how much or determine how much you will set aside in terms of the contingency reserve to mitigate any unknown risk that you identify later on during your project management life cycle. Also, be sure to consult your risk management plan for the description of the content and format of your risk response plan. Like we discussed earlier, you need to actually be consistent in the methodology you are utilizing for your risk management. So always consult your risk management plan for description and content and format of risk response plan, so you are consistent with the format of what you plan to use. Because at that point when you are planning, you have a clear head. During the project life cycle, a lot of things are happening concurrently. So you always consult your risk management plan once you're updating it regularly too, for all the description and content you need for your risk response plans. The last one will be to incorporate your risk response plan into the overall project plan, so the strategies can be implemented and monitored. Thank you for listening with me or working with me through the video. Let's take 30 seconds to open the activity file. So we'll discuss about the activity involved in this topic. Open your doing work on file, the risk register Excel file. Scenario: you work for a small development company that builds home for low-income family. The home build program's purpose is to build a 2 or 3 bedroom home for each qualifying family under the sponsorship of Linda Michaels. Your company is getting ready to build a new home for the Andrews family. The family has qualified for the home build program and is the next family on that list. You have been assigned to manage the project. Each build project is named by the address. And the next available lot is located in 234 West Adam Street. For the 234 West Adam project, the scheduling will need to be managed across and around delivery of products and materials. The cost of these materials have been known to fluctuate lately due to the uncertain economy. Occasionally, the project is in this part of town are vandalized during construction. Of course, you may be mindful of the weather during construction. It is somewhat unpredictable, but as far as you know, the forecast is looking good for the next few weeks. Now that you've identified how to manage projects and how the costs are, you can take the next step to determine what the project risks are. How would you like to review the project's potential project risk in the risk register? So first thing you do is to open your risk register Excel sheets, as I explained earlier. Then use the following questions to fill the first 4 columns of the risk register for the 234 West Adams project. The remaining columns will be filled later during the discussion. So the first question, which of the following might be a risk, either opportunity or threat for these projects? Choose 3 from the options. 1, fluctuating material cost. 2, finding another family for the house if the Andrews family move to another town. 3, weather. 4, vandalism. From the historical information you've gotten from, pause the video, answer the question, then play. From the historical information you've gotten from the question, you've seen that there is a fluctuating material cost due to the economy. So that is a risk you need to identify. You've talked about weather being uncertain during this, being unpredictable during this period. So weather is it. And you have vandalism reports being mentioned. So you have a potential risk being fluctuating material cost, weather, and vandalism. The next question, would you classify the weather as a positive risk, that is an opportunity, or a negative risk, that is a threat? Pause, answer, then play. Your answer would depend on what kind of weather. If it's a bad weather, then it's a threat because it might cause delay to your building activities and schedule. With a good weather, then it's only an opportunity if it enables you to work longer or more building hours to actually be accomplished and helps you finish the house ahead of schedule. So your answer should depend on the type of weather being discussed. If it's a good weather, sure. If it's a good weather that is not increasing your scheduling or increasing your output, then it's really not an opportunity like that. But if it's a good weather that improves your efficiency in terms of your activities, then that is an opportunity. If it's a bad weather that reduces your working hours, then that's a threat. Let's move to the next question. Save the file you have under your risk register. Next question, what event might you consider as triggers for the risk? So the risk you identified in the options below, that's the material, weather, and vandalism. What will you consider as triggers for those risks? Pause, answer, then play. You can listen, your answer could be in terms of how do you identify possible inflations. You can get inflation information from the news you listen to, which tells you forecasting possible inflation could cause material prices to rise dramatically. In terms of understanding the triggers for weather, you can have your weather forecast in your newspaper or on your TV that tells you what the weather will be like, and that forms a trigger for a bad weather threat. Then the occurrence of vandalism in the neighborhood is a trigger for possible vandalism on that job site. Now you need to now save your risk register Excel sheet and open the risk register solution and compare your files to it. Thank you for staying with me, and I hope we are able to cover all the grounds and improve the knowledge on risk management, assessment, identification, and management of risk. Thank you.